Siddhartha, I want to start by asking you about an event that, in a sense, to me, really defines many of the questions thrown up by the immense vulnerability we feel about mortality and disease, which in the end is the great leveler. Steve Jobs. You read his biography by Walter Isaacson, and well before Steve ever knows that he's ill, he's actually somebody, when he's not tripping acid, is actually being very careful about how he eats. He's doing fruit and vegetable diets. He's obsessive about his fitness, about his health. And then, in his 50s, this iconic genius man goes just like that, redefining for many of us in that Stanford commencement speech, and you're a Stanford alumni, how we look at life and how we look at death. Great leveler, that story of Steve Jobs. It doesn't matter if you're a genius. It doesn't matter how successful you are. It doesn't even matter how much care you take to look after your health. We just don't understand cancer, do we?
Well, Steve Jobs' death was a brutal reminder to me about the extent to which we have failed people like Steve Jobs. By that I mean, here's a man who gave us life-altering technologies. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, did we give him life-altering technologies back? And I think we didn't. And then the question is, why not? What prevents us today from changing the landscape of cancer? Now, what's interesting to me about Steve Jobs' form of cancer is I would bet you that in a decade's time, if we really put our minds to it, my suspicion is that those variants of cancer, these rare variants of cancer that we begin to understand, probably will be treatable. Not curable, but probably treatable. So it's really a failure of imagination to me, that death is a failure of imagination. Now, the question that you're asking is, how does someone who's so obsessed with their life, with their living, become susceptible? And the answer is because cancer, unlike any other disease, cancer is inbuilt into our genomes. And let that thought sink in, because it's not just a biological thought, it's really a philosophical thought. And that is that the very genes that allow our bodies to grow, our embryos to grow, if you take those genes and you distort them, if you mutate them, you unleash cancer. You can't therefore, it's not a phenomenon therefore that you can untwin from your body. It's very much part of the normal cellular growth process. And when it goes awry, it becomes a cancer, it becomes a tumor. So, and that of course gives rise to one of the biggest challenges in medicine, in cancer medicine, but in medicine in general, which is how does one discriminate normal growth from malignant growth? And that's the challenge that was faced by Steve Jobs and his doctors as well. And this is a question that keeps coming on over and over again. As our population moves in the world, in some parts of the world, towards facing these chronic diseases, many of these chronic diseases turn out to be pathological manifestations of normalcy. Yeah. And that's what's very complicated about it. It's not like any other disease.
You do make that point in your book about how, in a sense, all of us in this room are possibly carrying a cell that can mutate at some form into a cancerous cell.
By its very nature.
By its very nature. Yeah. Which, in a sense, really undoes previous understandings of how to stop this, how to prevent it, how to deal with it. And if we are all potentially cancerous beings, if I may use that phrase, how do you still make the point in your book, and you've made this repeatedly in conversations afterwards, that you wanted to challenge the nihilism, right, in a sense, in the mental response to cancer? Because there seems to be something so fatalistically ordained if we're all potentially going to have our bodies mutate into cancerous cells.
Well, the simplest way to counteract that nihilism is to make the argument that Richard Dole does, the famous epidemiologist who eventually figured out the link between tobacco and lung cancer. Richard Dole says that death in old age is an inevitability. Yeah. It's death in young age that's the problem. That's the new frontier. Let me put some numbers into context which are important. In the United States, 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women will develop cancer during their lifetimes. 1 in 4 men and women will die of cancer. It's a statistical inevitability in that sense. If you just take young men and women dying of cancer, that, let's say the cutoff might be the age 60, you're still at hundreds of thousands of deaths per year. Yeah. So it's actually simple to counteract the nihilism, because you cannot be nihilistic about an illness that is killing literally hundreds of thousands of men and women every year. You have to have some way of understanding this and moving ahead. So I think that's my own personal view against the nihilistic qualities.
Your book is many things. You know, it's a medical perspective, but it's also a deeply personal interface between you as an oncologist and your patients. This book was born in a question asked to you by one of your patients who was suffering from an extreme form of abdominal cancer. Please explain this to me. Explain to me, I'm willing to fight, but tell me what I'm fighting. But when I'm hearing you, and I don't mean to be pessimistic this beautiful morning in Goa, what I'm actually hearing is the best that a doctor can do is to say, and you make this point somewhere, you want to live long enough to see your son graduate, I'll help you get there. You want to live long enough to take your mother one last time on that holiday you never took her to, I'll get you there. Beyond that, can't do much.
Well, I mean, the question is, what is then beyond that, right? What is the beyond? I mean, our lives are, and I make this point in the book too, our lives are stitched together precisely through these kinds of memories. The question of beyond, of course, extends forever. And the point, I suspect, is not to extend lives and memories, you know, into Methuselah, but rather, in fact, figure out what to do about death in young age, as I call it. You know, there is, of course, Io, the Greek demigoddess, who's cursed to live forever. And Io very famously says that to Perseus, Io says that it is her curse because she watches everyone else decay, but she is decayless. And in fact, it becomes her curse. My point is that, again, lives are stitched together through memory. We remember things, we so in fact, the question of the beyond becomes an abstract question unless it's made into the concrete question of what is now, what happens next, what are you waiting for, what are you trying to do? And I try to address some of these questions in the center of the book.
But how do you offer hope, or you don't?
Oh, you can, I mean, I think my own sense of hope is negotiable. There are no absolute hopes. My own sense of it is that it is negotiable in the sense that if there are no archetypal human beings, there are no archetypal memories, so why should there be an archetypal hope? People's hopes change. They become reconciled to realities, and those hopes change over time. And if we create a kind of archetypal way of looking at it, if we anatomize it without understanding that there's a personality that lives behind that anatomy, I think we do a big disservice. We do a literary disservice, that's for sure.
You said in your opening remarks that you feel that, in a sense, Steve Jobs' death was a failure of imagination, that here was a man who stood for innovative breakthrough technology, and yet medical technology in a way failed him. Mm-hmm. Did medical technology fail him because it hasn't kept pace with new understandings of cancer, or did it just fail him because the human mind has not reached that critical moment in technology, medical technology?
Well, I think the human mind has not clearly reached that critical moment, and the question is, why not? I happen to believe that this is, Justin was talking about some elemental problems of humans. I happen to believe this is one of those elemental problems. In other words, as we move forward into our future, we just have to face up to these problems, you know, energy, food, water, and health. And so my suspicion is that we're far from committing the kind of resources, the kind of resource intensiveness that we need to address these kinds of problems, the kind of problems that affect human health not only globally, but also across, very specific to very specific nations. The termination of life caused by human immunodeficiency viruses in sub-Saharan Africa is obviously has already changed sub-Saharan African history and will do so forever. So unless we contend with these kinds of figures, I think we're kind of losing grip on what the real big problems are. And I think the lack of resources is a major problem.
The emperor of all maladies is as much medicine as it is history and literature in many ways. And you go back into history, you're looking for the first recorded incidents of cancer. They may not have been called that. There's this absolutely riveting account of a Persian queen who cuts off her breast, which would be the modern day mastectomy, right? But you make the interesting point that from then to now, actually the response, let's say to breast cancer, hasn't changed. There's still this whispery stigma, embarrassment associated with it. Why is that?
Well, for breast cancer in particular, it is not only about the shame of the pathological body, but sexual shame. It's actually the juxtaposition of those two, and we still see it. I recount the story in the book of Fanny Rosenau in 1950, who calls up the New York Times, and she says she's a breast cancer survivor, and she says, I'd like to place an advertisement for a survivors group of women with breast cancer. And there's a long pause, and Rosenau's hanging on the phone saying, well, why is there this long pause? And finally, the society editor of the New York Times gets on, not the health editor, but the society editor, and says, you know, Mr. Rosenau, we can't use the words breast and cancer in the New York Times. What if we said that this was a survivors group of women with diseases of the chest wall? So, so it's literally death by euphemism. And what's interesting is that some of that stigma still survives today. I'll give you a good example of this, a very moving example to me in the midst of a very dense statistical study. It's actually, it reminds us of several themes that we'll pick up in this conversation. About a decade ago, a group of researchers at Harvard became interested in the question whether there's a link between obesity and breast cancer. And as you know, that link epidemiologically has been proven. There is a link between obesity and breast cancer. So it might be reasonable to ask the question whether there's a link between a high-fat diet and breast cancer. It started as a very obviously very clinical epidemiological study. And they collected a cohort of women and asked them with breast cancer, and an age-matched cohort of women without breast cancer. And they asked them what their diets were in the preceding 10 years. So they recorded these diets, and the answer was very crystalline, very clear. Women with breast cancer had consumed diets higher in fat. Women without breast cancer, matched, had consumed diets lower in fat. Case closed. But there was a twist. It turns out that these women had also recorded, they had been actually chosen for this reason, they had actually recorded their real diets before the diagnosis of breast cancer 10 years ago. So they went back, unlocked the cabinets, and took those questionnaires out, which were the real diets. And was there a difference? No. So in other words, women with breast cancer had selectively remembered consuming diet. This is in 1997, 47 years after Fanny Rosenau's call to the New York Times. They had selectively remembered diets higher in fat. Now, you could ask why? Because of guilt, right? Because they said to themselves, I must have done something wrong. I must have done something wrong with my body. And what's the big wrong that one does in 1997? You know, it's consuming a bag of potato chips, right? And so even today, when we think that we've gone through this kind of stigma, the stigma still exists. It's very much part of us. So it's a reminder of how far we've come and how far we haven't to some extent.
And you've said that one of the reasons that you actually wrote this book is, A, of course, you didn't know what to say to this patient who said to you, what am I battling? And B, because you want to remove the stigma.
Right.
How does this stigma go away? It's ingrained. I think perhaps you make the point that there's a sexual embarrassment, especially maybe with forms of cancer that relate to parts of the body that are to do with our sexual organs. Well, do you find that women respond to that extent differently from men when they have to talk about
just to
cancer?
give you one example, cervical cancer, which is killing hundreds of thousands of women around the world every year, should largely be an eliminatable disease through vaccination and through education and various other measures. We know that it's linked to a virus. We have vaccines against many strains of the virus. There's a huge debate going on in the United States, even as we speak, whether women should be vaccinated and to some extent whether even men should be vaccinated. In fact, it turns out that if you vaccinate boys you can actually prevent cervical cancer in women. So here's another good example. This is 2011. There's a large debate going on, partly fed by religious orthodoxy, about whether we should be vaccinating women for a preventable form of cancer. Seems to me completely absurd, this debate, but it's very much part of the political debate in the United States today.
And I think most people, I don't know, wouldn't even know that it is possible to have a preventive vaccine. I mean, I didn't know.
Yeah.
It was a very personal journey for you, when you wrote this book. I'm curious to know where you walk that line between not becoming a peddler of hope, where hope doesn't exist, but being that person who, as you have said in your own words, is part of another person's life in a hyper-intense, life-changing, quite literally moment of their existence. Do you get emotionally attached?
I think you have to be. I think, I tell people that I think medicine is the most complex profession that we do as human beings. It involves kinds of dimensions of your brain which I think are deployed in no other professions, from the very scientific to the very to using the literary aspects of your brain, to using epidemiology, mathematics. We bring all of these things, we funnel them in, and out comes this peculiar entity that we call medicine. And I think that because of that reason, I bring my work home with me. Actually, I encourage myself to bring my work home with me. I tell myself it would be absurd to leave such an intense form of work behind. So in fact, every day around dinner, I mean, we have a conversation about what happened in the hospital. I'm also a researcher, but every day I try to have that conversation because it only animates and makes real what already exists. And it doesn't compartmentalize it. So in fact, I'm a big proponent. I tell my students, take your work home with you. Don't pretend as if it stops when you pick up your dinner. It doesn't stop. And if you pretend that, you're in the wrong profession.
What does that do to your own emotional equilibrium? Because the patient who actually was the reason you wrote this book, or was the starting point for that journey, she died. She
dies, yeah. After 6 years of a remission, she dies. What does that do to you emotionally? I think doctors. I grieve. Doctors grieve. It's part of normal human life. Grieving is one of the most fundamental things that we do. And if we forget to grieve, we deny our reality. We deny our mortality. I mean, so why should we compartmentalize grief in this very artificial way? It seems to me a kind of construction of a particular variant of living well, which seems very hollow to me, in which you compartmentalize your life. You grieve in only certain spaces, and the other spaces are not meant for grieving. This kind of compartmentalization to me is just nonsensical. So I don't believe in it. I don't buy it. When our interactions with the world are not compartmentalized, in fact, happen all the time. They happen in real time.
In many ways, it's interesting because, again, coming back to Steve Jobs, there is this whole argument being made that the greatest minds stand at the intersection of science and humanities and liberal arts. And I mean, having known you personally from before, and also this is now well chronicled and it's evident in your book, you bring a lot of a literary mindset to medicine, to cancer. Was that deliberate, or did it just come to you as a kind of instinctive second nature?
Well, I was reminded of Primo Levi, whose book I think probably represents. We were talking about batteries that store kilowatts of energy. That book, Primo Levi's book, Survival at Auschwitz, pound for pound or paper for paper, stores more kilowatts of energy, human energy, than anything I've ever read. Primo Levi was in Auschwitz, was almost killed. Many of his compatriots were killed in Auschwitz. He came out of all of this He hobbled his way really back through a devastated Germany, back to Italy. And at the end of it, someone asked him, well, Primo Levi, he wrote this book, many of these books, the periodic table being one of them, Survival at Auschwitz being the other one, which are chronicles of the most beautiful and one of the most amazing books I've ever read. And someone says, Primo, how do you define yourself? And he said, I'm a chemist. And to me, the humility in that is very reflective. You know, Primo Levi did not say to himself, I'm going to change world literature. Yeah. He said, I'm a chemist, and the work flowed out of that. He was once asked, actually it's very interesting too, Primo was once asked, well, why did you survive Auschwitz? You know, millions of Jews were killed. What made you survive Auschwitz? And he said, very movingly, he said, well, I was young, and I could speak more than one language, right? So for instance, it's what he didn't say that's very important. He didn't say, oh, because I had so much resilience. Oh, it's because I had so many skills. It's because it was my street smarts. And so he, in some ways, and you know this, Barkha, but in some ways, all of that is stitched into the book, but you never find it. So, you know, was I looking for literary inspiration? I didn't need to find literary inspiration because it was plenty there.
Well, as the first warning bell comes, sort of like a metaphor for life and death, I'm just wondering, Steve Jobs sort of made us question our understanding of death and therefore our understanding of life. Has that happened for you as someone who works so closely with people who pretty much within a finite time, well, we all die within a finite time, but maybe this is a kind of accelerated interface with death. Has it changed your understanding of life? Because you said somewhere that in a sense, it's like the debate around cancer strips you naked and then just leaves you with the basics of life.
Yes. I mean, how can it not? I mean, I flew across the Atlantic, and I was off the grid for 12 hours. I landed, I opened my email, and there were a record of 3 deaths. How can it not change your life? And you know,
how has it changed you as a person?
I mean, the changes are so deep that to even recount them would become like recounting the entire story of this journey. Just simply speaking, it's obviously a very humbling experience. It's you live that line, and the question is, I mean, how do you then live with fear? We talked a little bit earlier about living with a different kind of fear. This too, the fear of this variant of mortality, is also like the sword of Damocles hanging on your head all the time. And the question is, how do you then live the fulfillment of your life, one's life, through all of this? And my answer is really, it really forces us to reimagine what living is.
And what is it?
A stitching together of memory, creating a space for oneself that is enriching for others. You know, the kind of things that we take very much for granted become very powerful, and you know, they become immediately powerful when you hear this word. Patients often say that it's like a wake-up call from the other side of life. And to me, having heard this in the voices of others all the time, I certainly sense it myself. So.
You said somewhere as we wind down in this conversation that thousands of books had actually been written on cancer before you started writing this one, and yet you felt you couldn't answer the most basic questions of your patients. Do you think we're any closer to answering those questions today?
Oh, I think we are, very much so. As I said, just to give you the example of Jobs' case, I mean, I think there's very little doubt to me that we will probably change the landscape in the future. We just have to be clever about doing this. We have to inspire a generation of scientists. You know, the Japanese speak about a lost decade, as you know very well. My biggest fear is that in the midst of the kind of distractions that we have, we're going to face a lost decade of science. And that lost decade of science is going to really impact all of our lives. We kind of forged a lost decade of science. The kind of energy that a 35-year-old has, a 25 or a 35-year-old has, is fundamentally different from the kind of energy that a 45 or 55-year-old has. If we can't give, if you can't empower the 25 or 35-year-old to engage in what I think is one of the most rich conversations we've had as a civilization, the scientific conversation, we're doing them an enormous disservice. And we will pay for that disservice with our lives. Just to give you one number to hang your hats on, the annual budget of the National Cancer Institute in America, and just to use that's just one example, there are other cancer institutes around the world, is $5 billion. The annual budget of the Food and Drug Administration in America is $4 billion. The United States spent more per month in Iraq in 2008 than the combined annual budgets of the National Cancer Institute and the Food and Drug Administration. That's just to give you one example of the kind of resources that are being expended in arenas in comparison to very fundamental things about health.
And I'm getting the sign, I think, that we have to close. So let me end on, I'm sorry, I don't think we're taking questions. So sir, later, please. We're not doing questions. Siddhartha is here, and maybe you can sort of catch him in the corridor and have a chat with him. I was going to, because we've spoken about such deep things, just end on a lighter note that when the New York Times said that you don't look like a scientist, what's a scientist meant to look like?
I don't know, Barkha. I don't know. I suspected that they wanted me in a white coat. I don't know. It was just a little bit. I was mystified. I wrote to Charles McGrath and I said, "What were you expecting?" It was. I think they wanted to lighten up the conversation themselves, and so therefore I got stuck with this. I got stuck with the line. But there you have it.
It's a great line. Thank you for your inspiring book and your thoughts this morning. Thank you very much, Siddhartha.